The Origins of Proto-Afro-Asiatics. So we'll begin from Shem to Israel. This is part one of a video series. So in order to know who the ancient Hebrews of Israel are, we must understand who were their ancestors according to the scriptures. The Israelites were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But who were the ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? According to the Hebrew text, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, ancient ancestor was a man named Shem. If you read Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 through 26, it says, "This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters." So from 10 to 26 it reads, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abraham. So from the lineage, starting with Jacob to Israel, from Jacob to Isaac to Abraham, going from Abraham back to Shem, we see that this lineage is very specific and male-oriented. The Israelites basically are a Semitic people because they descend from Shem. According to outside sources or according to the academic understanding of the Israelites, they are also Semitic. The Israelites were a confederation of Iron Age Semitic-speaking tribes of the ancient Near East. The Hebrew people are mostly taken as synonymous with Semitic-speaking Israelites. So historically, the Israelites also spoke a Semitic language called Hebrew. Paleo-Hebrew script is the name used by modern scholars to describe the script found in Canaan, Canaanite inscriptions from the region of biblical Israel and Judea. Proto-Semitic, the North Semitic alphabet, is considered the earliest trace of alphabetic writing and the common ancestor of both the ancient South Arabian script and the Phoenician alphabet, which led to many modern alphabets, including the Greek alphabet. And so here is an example of the Proto-Semitic and Paleo-Hebrew. This is sort of like a timeline going backwards from where these scripts and languages come from. Paleo-Hebrew to Phoenician alphabet to Proto-Semitic script to even the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And here is a visual map showing from Paleo-Hebrew to Canaanite to Northwest Semitic to Central Semitic to Western Semitic and Proto-Semitic. So the Hebrew language also goes back to Proto-Semites, Proto-Semitic tongue. So the Israelites are ethnically a Semitic people because they descend from Shem. The Israelites are also linguistically Semitic because they descend from Shem. So the ancestors of the Israelites are Semites. Now, one important factor about the Semitic language is that it's part of the Afroasiatic language family. Afroasiatic, of, relating to, or being a family of languages widely distributed over southwestern Asia and Africa, including the Semitic. And then Semitic, of relating to or consisting of a subfamily of the Afroasiatic language family that includes languages such as Hebrew. Afroasiatic, also called Afro-Sam languages, formerly Hemito-Semitic or Semito-Hamitic languages of common origin found in the northern part of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and some islands and adjacent areas in Western Asia. So here's a map of the Afroasiatic languages, and it is spread across the Middle East and in Africa. So, with that being said, Israelites are an Afroasiatic Semitic people. Therefore, we should look into the origins of Semitic and Afro-Asiatic. First, we'll take an academic approach to the birth of the Semitic and Afro-Asiatics. Then we'll take a biblical approach, which will be in the next video, part 2. But since we're taking an academic approach, we'll dive into genetics as well. The main genetic term we need to understand is a haplogroup, which I done a video on. You can refer back to that video for more information, but I'll give a quick breakdown right now of what a haplogroup is. So a haplogroup is a genetic population group of people who share a common ancestor on either their paternal or maternal line. Particular haplogroups are associated with well-known ancestral groups such as the Vikings, Aboriginal Australians, and Celts. By the way, this is from Living DNA. What are haplogroups? Living DNA explain. So maternal haplogroup. Maternal haplogroups from the mother are determined by assessing mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. This also means that you will have the same maternal haplogroup as anyone else in your direct maternal line. Your mom, brother, sister, aunt, and grandmother on your mother's side follow that haplogroup back to its origin, and you'll find a single mutation occurred at some point in history. So to simplify this, a mitochondrial haplogroup is passed down from mother to daughter, mother to daughter, mother to daughter, but the son can also have it. A man can have a maternal haplogroup as well because men carry both the X and Y chromosome. Now, what are paternal haplogroups? The paternal haplogroup relates to your Y chromosome, and since that is the sex-determining chromosome for men, it is passed down from father to son. Also, women don't have a Y chromosome. They will not have a paternal haplogroup by default. However, they are able to find out what their paternal haplogroup is if a male relative from the father's side, ideally a brother, father, uncle, or grandfather, is also tested. So to simplify this, the Y chromosome is passed down from father to son, father to son, father to son, and women do not carry this Y chromosome. But if a woman wants to know the male lineage of her male relatives, the men will have to take it, such as a brother and an uncle, father. And the only reason women don't carry the Y chromosome is because, of course, they can't carry both chromosomes like men. Men are both X and Y, and women can't do this. So that is why. And so to conclude, just keep in mind these terms. Y DNA is paternal DNA, it's male, and then mtDNA is maternal DNA, that's female. And the men, as I said earlier, can carry both the paternal and the maternal, whereas women can only carry the maternal. So here's a visual representation of this. This is from ISOGG Wiki, and it says a haplogroup is a genetic population group of people who share a common ancestor on the paternal line and the maternal line. So have this as a representation of yourself, you having your father's paternal or Y DNA, and then your mother's maternal line. This would be if you was a man, you'll carry both, but if you was a female, you'll only carry the mother. Here's another visual representation of this. Let's say you, a man and a woman have a child, two children, a son and a daughter, and so the son will carry both the father's Y DNA and the mother's maternal DNA, represented in blue, and the sister will carry only the maternal DNA, represented in red. So, also haplogroups can be used to trace migrations, common descent, and ethnic origins. This is from What is a Haplogroup and What Can It Tell You About Your Family Tree. This is from ancestralfindings.com, and it reads, at its essence, a haplogroup is an ancestral clan. Some clans are the Vikings, Native Americans, all tribes, Celts, Aboriginal Australians, and other such groups. Your haplogroup tells you where your ancestors came from deep back in time. There are also male and female haplogroups, so you can see where your male and and female sides of the family originated back in prehistoric times. As you as with as with Y-DNA, which traces the male line from father to son, and maternal DNA, which traces the female line from mother to daughter, haplogroups also follow straight male and female descendancy lines. And here's a map to the right, basically representing haplogroups and people groups, like R1b being ancestral Eurasian clade, or haplogroup I1 being a North Proto-European clade. So here is haplogroups of the world. Every human being, every Homo sapiens sapien has a haplogroup, and here's basically just the distribution of these haplogroups throughout the world. So, linguists and geneticists commonly use haplogroups to find the genetic and linguistic origins and migrations of ancient ethnic populations. This is why it's important to know about haplogroups when studying the origins of Semitic and Afroasiatic. With that being said, let's begin. So, the origins of Afroasiatic and Semitic people. What are the genetic, linguistic, and ethnic origins of Semites and Afroasiatic? One of the theories for the origins of Semites and Afroasiatic is the Horn of Africa. Leon Bender in 1997 proposed a scenario upon linguistic grounds wherein Semitic languages originated in Ethiopia and crossed the Red Sea. Here is a study from various linguists and geneticists labeled on the African origins of the Afroasiatic language family, a response to Diamond and Bellwood. This is from Christopher Eretz, S-O-Y Kita, and Paul Newman. So it reads, this extensive, well-grounded linguistic research places the Afroasiatic homeland in the southeast Sahara or adjacent Horn of Africa. Diakonoff does revise his common Semitic homeland, moving it from solely within Northeast Africa to areas straddling the Delta and Sinai, but continues to place the other five branches origins wholly in Africa. Archaeological data suggests a pre-food producing population movement from Africa into the Levant, consistent with the linguistic arguments for a pre-Neolithic migration of pre-Proto-Semitic speakers out of Africa via Sinai. A critical reading of the data in genetic analysis, specifically those of Y chromosome phylogeography and TAQI49AF haplotypes, supports the hypothesis of populations moving from the Horn or southeastern Sahara northwards to the Nile Valley, northwest Africa, the Levant, and Aegean. The geography of the M35/215 lineage, which is of Horn/East African origin, is largely coordinated with the range of Afroasiatic. Here is another study called Y Haplogroups, Archaeological Cultures, and Language Families, a review of the possibility of multidisciplinary comparisons using the case of E-M35. This is by Andrew Langsker. And so it reads, when it comes to scenario 1, using Eret's scenario, E-M35 and Afroasiatic must have been together from their first dispersals out of the general area of the Horn of Africa. A large number of E-M35 lineages came north to Egypt, which is where E-M78, for example, is thought to have come into existence. E-M123, for example, is a clade of E-M35, which probably originated in the southern Levant, just to the northeast of Egypt. Many branches of E-M78 from nearby northern Egypt are also present in the Semitic-speaking populations of this region. As a final scenario, we compare the genetic evidence to a synthesis indicated to represent the possibility that Afroasiatic and Semitic are younger than they are in the well-known proposals of Erit and Matovey. If the starting point for Afroasiatic would be anywhere within the corridor stretching from the Nile Delta to the Horn of Africa, and if its dispersal started well into the Heliocene, more recently than in the scenarios of Erit and Matovey, then E-M35 is also certain to have been present in that Proto-Afro-Asiatic population. While E-M123 has the appearance of being a subclade of E-M35 that may have originated in the Levant quite early, it is still basically true that the E-M35 diversity found in the Levant today is a branch of the same diversity found in Egypt, which also had a high E-M123 diversity. This would make Afroasiatic and probably almost E-M35 and probably also E-M35 both representatives of the African contribution to the full development of the Neolithic, but not necessarily playing any special role in the pre-Neolithic. Basically, one of the theories for the origins of Afroasiatic and Semitic is that they come from the Horn of Africa and they would be the carriers of haplogroup E. So here is a visual representation of this. Of course, here is the Afroasiatic homeland with it being in the Horn of Africa along with Proto-Semites. And here is one of the proposed origins of haplogroup DE being in the Horn of Africa, migrating upwards just like Afroasiatics and Semites would have. And then they would have been in the area of northern Egypt near Sinai, as we can see, and then they would have poured in. But you do see basically the same type of migration with language and DNA. Here's another example, but this time it's dispersing. We see the dispersal of these various branches of haplogroup E, and we see the dispersal of the various linguistic groups and people groups of Afroasiatic. And as we can see, it matches very, very perfectly. And then here's just another visual representation of this, the haplogroup E marker originating in the Horn of Africa, then migrating throughout the Middle East and even into Europe. And here is the birthplace of Afroasiatic, of course, being dispersed into the Middle East. So we basically see the same thing happening. Both the DNA and the language and homeland match up. Here's the final example I'll show. Here is number 1, Proto-Afro-Asiatic. Then you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5, then 6, 7, and 8. 8 being Proto-Semitic. But if you go all the way back to the Proto-Semitic origins, their ancient ancestors, it will be in the Horn of Africa. And here is a visual representation of the aftermath of all this. Haplogroup E basically being spread throughout in the Middle East and also in North Africa. We see it here in the Levant and Southern Arabia, the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa, near Egypt, Northwest Africa, and further south of Northwest Africa. But basically, and in the Mediterranean, but basically all over. So, how would these Afroasiatics and Semites look? Since we're dealing with ancient populations, these early Proto-Afro-Asiatics and pre-Proto-Semites would have looked Proto-Ethiopic if they were coming from the Horn of Africa. So here is a Proto-Ethiopic phenotype. As we can see here, concentrated in the Horn of Africa. Now let's read the distribution and the physical traits. Ancient type that inhabited the southwestern Eritrean lowlands prior to the arrival of Ethiopians and possibly resembles early out of Africa types, was still common from Kenya to Sudan during historic times. Now, the physical traits: dark, sometimes medium brown skin and kinky curly hair, dolichocephalic with robust, bony, and elongated facial features, prognathism with relatively pronounced. So another good example is the omotic phenotype. The omotic phenotype, probably a relic of pre-Neolithic periods, and dark brown skin and kinky curly hair, usually dolichocephalic, mildly pityrium, which basically means a wide nose. The lips are full and cheekbones often prominent. And here's their concentration, Horn of Africa as well. Ultimately, these early Afroasiatics and Semites would have looked Ethiopic or African if their origins truly was from the Horn of Africa. Conclusion: the ancestors of the Israelites would have emerged from the Horn of Africa, where early Afroasiatic and Semitic populations migrated from. Therefore, their genotype would be Y-DNA haplogroup E, and their phenotype would be Proto-Ethiopic. Here is a visual representation of everything we covered. We know about linguists that talk about the origins of Semites and Afroasiatics coming from Ethiopia. Here is the phenotype of what these ancient people would have been. And here is the migration patterns of these Proto-Semites and Afroasiatics. And here is the genotype showing this migration. So everything lines up. Another theory for the origin of Semites and Afroasiatic is Yemen. So let's look at the Yemen origins of Afroasiatics. So here's a map showing this, Semitic being in the region of modern-day Yemen. And so this is a section from Peter Solomon Kovacs, who is a known geneticist and linguist. Here is all his credentials and what he does. And so he says, my theory is that when the Proto-Semitic language left the Afroasiatic homeland of Northeast Africa, not just one lineage left, but a group of Proto-Semitic people from this region that included all the Y-DNA haplogroups then present in Northeast Africa. It is possible that Northwest Semitic Hebrew people and languages dispersed into the Levant from Northeast Africa's Nile region around 5000 BCE. Thus, the earliest out-of-Africa settlement of Proto-Semitic people was likely in Yemen, on the southeastern region of the Arabian Peninsula. They then spread to the east and northeast to enter Mesopotamia and found the Semitic kingdom of Akkad and the Akkadian Empire. In this group, many of us conclude that haplogroup E is one of the major founding haplogroups of the Semitic people, and that haplogroup E people were the ones who brought Proto-Semitic language out of the Afroasiatic homeland in Northeast Africa into the Levant and Mesopotamia. Again, we're met with the idea of haplogroup E being the founding lineage of Afroasiatic and Semitic people. But if Yemen was the birthplace of Afroasiatic and Semitic, then what would early Afroasiatic and Semites look? Here is a book called Travelers to the Middle East, from Burchardit to Thrister, and this is edited by Godfrey Nash, and it says, the people of Arabia belong to two distinct and apparently quite different races. The Arabs of southern Arabia are smaller, darker, coarser featured, and nearly beardless. All authorities agree that the southern Arabians are nearly related by origin to the Abyssinians. So who are the Abyssinians? The Habasha people are the Abyssinians. They are a Semitic-speaking, language-speaking peoples, mainly found in the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Some within diasporic communities have adopted the term to refer to all people of Eritrean and Ethiopian origin. So the Eritrean and Ethiopian people, or Habesha people, is probably a good example of what ancient Southern Arabians look like. Here's another book dealing with the racial types from South Arabia by Henry Field, and it says, racial affinities of the South Arab lie in Northeast Africa. A Negroid strain occurs in the belt from Africa through South Arabia to Malaysia, including the Dravidians of southern India. Ancient Yemeni seem to have phenotypically looked African or Dravidian, specifically those of Northeast Africa. So the Arabian Vidoid type is probably the best example. Ancient Vidid type of the Arabian Peninsula, found in Marib of South Oman around the Hadranite in Yemen. This type could be linked to the ancestral Arabian population, as well as the Dravidians of India. Dark brown skin, kinky or curly, ringlet black hair. And here is the region that they are. So this is another example of what a early Proto-Semitic, Proto-Afro-Asiatic could look like. Even in the 1930s to present day, people of Yemen are still quite dark-skinned. Here are some images of Yemeni people of Yemen, all the way back in 1932. And here are Yemeni people today in the modern era. So this means if we were to go back long ago before today, or the 1930s, or even ancient Yemeni people, if we wanted to go to the birth of Afroasiatic people in Yemen, then logically they too would be very dark-skinned and African-looking, especially if these Afroasiatics are originating in Yemen around the time of the Neolithic or even 5000 BC. They'll be very dark-skinned even, especially back then. So, conclusion. The early Afroasiatic Semitic ancestors of the Israelites could have emerged from Yemen. Therefore, their genotype would likely carry Y-DNA haplogroup E, and phenotypically, they could have looked like a Northeast African or a Dravidian or a modern-day Yemeni. And here's all the information put together that we covered. The linguistic and genetic origins of Afroasiatics being in Yemen, and here's a map showing the spread of Semitic to Yemen, and here is the phenotype of what these ancient people could have looked, since we're dealing with populations of people way before the 1930s, but even going as far back as the Neolithic, where they definitely would have been dark-skinned. Another theory for the origin of Semites and Afroasiatic is the Arabian Peninsula. So let's look into the Arabian Peninsula origins of Afroasiatic. So the Winkler-Caetani theory, named after its two most distinguished prominents, Hugo Winkler and Leon Caetani, claims that Arabia was originally a land of great fertility and the first home of the Semitic peoples. Through the millennia, it was undergoing a process of steady desertification, a drying up of wealth and waterways, and spread of the desert at the expanse of the cultivable land. The declining productivity of the peninsula, together with the increase in the number of inhabitants, led to a series of crises of overpopulation and consequently to a recurring cycle of invasions of the neighboring countries by the Semitic peoples of the peninsula. What's interesting about the Arabian Peninsula being one of the believed origins for Semitic people is that haplogroup E may have originated from this same location. One of the origins for haplogroup E is actually the Arabian Peninsula, which ties well with what we know so far about Afroasiatics having haplogroup E. 23andMe has actually covered this. They say it's possible that men carrying the DE haplogroup journeyed from Africa across the Red Sea and into the Arabian Peninsula. But it is also possible that DE originated within the Arabian Peninsula itself and later spread back to Africa. Geological distribution of these sub-Saharan African lineages in the Arabian Peninsula seems to indicate a prehistoric entrance of a noticeable portion of these lineages that participated in the building of the primitive Arabian population. The presence of two underived E-96 Saudi lineages raises interesting questions related to the microhaplogroup DE-YAP phylogeography. Regions near but external to northeast Africa, like the Levant or the southern Arabian Peninsula, could have served as a impetus for the early diversification of non-African unparental haplogroup varieties like Y chromosome DE-YAP star. This model would imply that both CF-P143 and the DE-YAP evolved nearby but outside Africa. One DE-YAP star ancestor would have spread to Asia and evolved to haplogroup D, while another DE-YAP star returned to Northeast Africa and evolved into haplogroup E. And by the way, this was from the study Saudi Arabian Y chromosome diversity and its relationship with nearby regions. And here is another study that I'm going to read dealing with haplogroup E originating in Arabia. This one is called Carriers of Mitochondrial DNA Microhaplogroup L3 basal lineages migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. So it reads, the split of the Y chromosome composites DE haplogroup is very similar to the age of mitochondrial DNA L3, and Eurasian origin and back migration to Africa has been proposed for the African Y chromosome haplogroup E. This correlation rather seems to be the result of a joint and global replacement of the old autochthonous male and female African lineages by the new Eurasian incomers. So basically what they're saying is that haplogroup E could be Eurasian and that they came into Africa and they replaced the old autochthonous males and females, which would be haplogroups such as A and B, and therefore this origin would have been outside of Africa. So where would it have been for haplogroup E? It reads, curiously, ancestral E star, and that star means a very old ancient form of E. So it says, curiously, ancestral E star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So we do find ancient ancestral lineages of E, or clades or nodes of E, in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So biologically, some believe Semites come from Arabia and that they were a brown Mediterranean people, also known as Euro-African. So this right here comes from the Field Museum of Natural History by Henry Fields. You can find on page 154, and it reads, physical anthropologists are certain that Mesopotamia was the eastern borderline for Semitic types of individuals, and that the Semites, whom we know as the brown Mediterranean peoples who invaded Mesopotamia from Arabia. Here is a book called General History of Africa, Volume 2, Ancient Civilizations of Africa, And it reads, particularly when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white. Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being nearer the mark. Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's Mediterranean or Eurafrican race. The term brown is, in this context, refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. So that's very interesting. So here's a book called The Passing of the Great Race. In this section on page 282 talks about the Eurafrican and the Mediterranean race, and it says the Mediterranean race was first defined by Sergi, who also called it Eurafrican. The Mediterranean race originated in Africa and is closely related to the Negro, both being long-skulled peoples descended from a common stock, the Eurafrican. So, therefore, if Semites do come from Arabia, and if Semites are a brown Mediterranean, brown Eurafrican people, then phenotypically wise, they would have looked Negroid. So this is basically the ancient population of Arabia. And many people actually do subscribe to this. This is a book called The Arabs by Bertram Thomas. It says the original inhabitants of Arabia then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of the Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malay, giving rise to the Hamitic people of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. Here's another book called The Negro in the New World, and it reads, it is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated as far as its natural conditions allowed by a primitive Negro stock. Now, this is very interesting because this sort of lines up with the DNA. Remember from the study, it says these sub-Saharan African lineages in the Arabian Peninsula seems to indicate a prehistoric entrance of a noticeable portion of these lineages that participated in the building of the primitive Arabian population. The presence of the two underived E-M 96 Saudi lineages raises interesting questions related to the microhaplogroup DE-YAP phylogeography. Therefore, the Proto-Ethiopic phenotype would probably be the best fit for these early Semites, including originating in the Arabian Peninsula. And here is the Proto-Ethiopic type. And this, again, like I'm saying, is probably a good example. But to conclude, the ancestors of the Israelites, Afroasiatic Semitic people, could have emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Their genotype would likely be haplogroup E based on the studies we just read, and their phenotype would likely be brown Mediterranean and brown African based on the books we read. Here's all the information put together for this. The Winkler-Cattani theory about Semites originating in Arabia, along with the phenotype of what these people could have looked like, as well as the genotype that seems to match the time period of when all this is going down. Another theory for the origin of Semites and Afroasiatic is the Eastern Sahara, or also known as the Nile Valley / Red Sea region. So let's look at the Eastern Saharan origin of Afroasiatics. So again, we're going back to this study called Why Haplogroups, Archaeological Cultures, and Language Families, a review of the probability of multidisciplinary comparisons using the case of E-M35 by Andrew Langsker. So it reads, there are several relatively uncontroversial proposals concerning the ancient movements of Afro-Asiatic languages, each of which we can immediately compare to haplogroup E-M35 and its subclades in population genetics. Both E-M35 male lineages on the one hand and Afroasiatic languages on the other are seen by specialists in the two respective fields as having moved prehistorically within the Crusini. A 2007 study refers to a bi-directional corridor along the Nile and/or the western coast of the Red Sea, from the Sinai and Mediterranean to the Horn of Africa. Also, in both fields, the population who lived in this corridor has obvious ancient connections to the Near East Levantine corridor, spreading to the Fertile Crescent, where such spread as EV13 and E-M34 may have their origins. Middle Eastern Semitic-speaking populations typically also have a smaller presence of E-M35 Eurasian lineages than most African populations of Afroasiatic speakers, with the apparent exception of Chadic. There is also, in both cases, a obvious connection to the west of the Nile in the direction of the Sahara and along the southern Mediterranean in the Maghreb. The people there are strongly associated with the distinct E-M81 and E-V65 subclades of E-M35 and the Berber branch of Afroasiatic languages. In both population genetics and linguists, the Levant branch re-entered Africa in historical periods, both in Egypt, which is now Arabic speaking, but was once home to the Egyptian language, and Ethiopia, where South Semitic languages now dominate in some areas, which are believed to have once been Cushitic speaking. In addition, indeed, there must have been much back and forth movements at these 2 points of contact between Africa and Asia. Of course, when we find such similar patterns in both languages and wide lineages, this can give us at least some confidence that the two population movements cause both patterns. With this in mind, it is proposed that we must at least assume a strong likelihood that E-M35 male lineages were involved in at least many of the migrations and cultural transmissions which caused the present and historical distributions of the Afroasiatic languages. So basically they're saying that haplogroup E and Afroasiatic perfectly overlap each other when it comes to population movement, and this is quite important. So here is a visual representation of this: the Eastern Sahara popping up Afro-Sans or Afroasiatic peoples, and here is the genetic representation of haplogroup E originating in this region of the Afro-Asiatic homeland of Proto-Semitic languages. Here's a book called In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory by John D. Bingston, who actually covers this as well. He says the overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afroasiatic having emerged in or near the Horn of Africa, which we covered earlier, or in the Nile Valley. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken there by M35 bears, specifically M35/78, and adopted by populations bearing M89 lineages. So here is a visual representation again of the Afro-Asiatic homeland near the Nile River or Eastern Sahara. And here's a visual representation of the spread of haplogroup E from the Nile Valley or the Eastern Sahara. And this includes Semites. Here is a perfect study that covers the link between haplogroup E and Afroasiatic. It's called Y chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afroasiatic languages and pastoralism. So it says most Y chromosome haplogroup diversity in Africa, however, is present within microhaplogroup E that seem to have appeared 21,000 through 32,000 years ago, somewhere between the Red Sea and Lake Chad. The Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afroasiatic languages and pastoralist populations. So here is P2 or E-P2, and here are all the lineages that descend from it, such as M215 and V38. So right here it reads, a branching in the network may once again represent an episode of human migration that carried the haplogroup E-M35 and its sub-haplogroups further to the western coast of the Red Sea, to Yemen, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, and concurrently down to southern Africa as part of a more recent Y chromosome motivated out of Africa migration episode. The PCA and MDS display similar interesting groupings of the Afar and Shio populations of Eritrea with their Near Eastern Arabian populations to conjure up on the genetic relationship of the two sides of the Red Sea. The arrival of the E-M35 and derived subclades, for example E-M123/E-M34 to Arabia, appear to be strongly linked to expansion into East Africa, North Africa, Europe, Southern Africa, and an event that is likely related to pastoralism, hastened by its advent and amendable for analysis and dating, usually using approaches similar to what was proposed for the co-migration of Y chromosome and disease traits. Although most of the data set in our study define the deep ancestry of the phyology, they still shed some information to our interpretation of recent phenomena, such as the current genetic diversity, the haplogroup E, that E haplogroup in an implication to the origin and spread of Afroasiatic languages and to the history of pastoralism. Moreover, more comparative genetic analysis between the two sides of the Red Sea, especially emphasizing on E-M123/E-M35 or E-M78 haplogroups, will not only redefine the route of exit of Homo sapiens sapiens from East Africa, but also the genealogies of Afroasiatic languages in the region. So basically all this is saying is that haplogroup E likely has its origin near the Red Sea, spreading basically both sides of the Red Sea, and Afroasiatics basically have the exact same type of route and origin. Now here's a study called Complex Genetic History of East Africa Human Populations. Over here I have it in a block of red, and it has down here what I underlined in yellow for B and E Proto-Semitic. And so for the B section and the E, it has haplogroup E basically being the haplogroup of these Proto-Semitic populations originating in the Eastern Sahara or the Nile Valley or near the Red Sea. And again, they're saying Proto-Semitic would be E, haplogroup E. Here's a visual representation of this again. Afroasiatic homeland of Proto-Semitic languages, and with haplogroup E being the base population. And here is the North Afroasiatic heartland and Semites popping out, leaving the Red Sea region or the Nile Valley, going into the Levant. Here is a website that goes into this again called haplogroup E1B1B Y-DNA by Ethiopia, and it says the Red Sea origins and Neolithic expansion. Haplogroup E1B1B, formerly known as E3B, represents the last major direct migration from Africa to Europe. E1B1B lineages are closely linked to the diffusion of Afroasiatic languages. So here is a chart showing the Paleolithic Red Sea region where haplogroup E would have originated from. And here is a map showing the Proto-Afro-Asiatics popping out and leaving the region of the Red Sea, going all throughout Africa and the Middle East, the spread of Afro-Asiatic languages, which includes Semitic. And here is a representation again, both of language and DNA, and the spread of these peoples. Yet again, we're met with the idea that haplogroup E is the lineage of early Afro-Asiatic and Semitic populations. But this time, the haplogroup would have originated near the Red Sea region of the Eastern Sahara. Now, how would these early Afro-Asiatic and Semites look? I believe the North Ethiopic phenotype is the best, common among the Red Sea coast, like we're talking about, and the Nile Valley, from Egypt to Eritrea, and deep into the Ethiopian highlands, often blends with Arabs and Yemenids that arrived in prehistoric times, sometimes in Arabia as well. Dark, sometimes medium, bronze, brown skin, tight, curly hair. So this is probably another good example of what a Proto-Semite would look like, or a Proto-Afro-Asiatic. And here's their distribution and homeland. Conclusion. The ancestors of the Israelites, Afro-Asiatic Semitic people, could have emerged from the Eastern Sahara. Therefore, their Y-DNA likely would be haplogroup E, according to the studies we just covered, and their phenotype would likely be Eastern Saharan, just like what we see when it comes to these ancient people in prehistoric times. And here is a representation of everything we covered just on one slide. Haplogroup E being the ancestor of Afroasiatics popping up near the Red Sea. Here's the phenotype of what these early Afroasiatics and Semites would look. And here below is the representation of the spread of Proto-Afro-Asiatics. And here's the genetic spread of Proto-Afro-Asiatics. Another theory for the origin of Semites and Afro-Asiatic is North Africa, or the Sahara/Sahel. So let's look into the North African origins of Afro-Asiatics. The Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. So here's a representation of Afroasiatics, the Green Sahara. So let's learn a little bit about that. The Sahara pump theory is a hypothesis that explains how fauna and flora migrated between Eurasia and Africa via a land bridge in the Levant region. It posits that extended periods of abundant rainfall lasting many thousands of years in Africa are associated with a green wet Sahara phase, during which larger lakes and more rivers existed. So here's an example of what the Green Sahara would have looked like. And down below is actually an image that once the Sahara had animals that couldn't live there today, such as giraffes and even elephants. So Going by the genetic route, uh, Rikinet, at a 2008 study, associated the sub-Saharan influences detected in the Natufian samples with the migration of E1B1B lineages from North Africa to the Levant and then into Europe. Recently, it has been proposed that E3B originated in sub-Saharan Africa and expanded into the Near East and North Africa at the end of the Paleocene. A Mesolithic population carrying group 3 lineages with the M35/M215 mutation expanded northwards from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Levant. Here's another study dealing with this, the Afroasiatic language phylum, African in origin or Asian. This is by Daniel F. McCall. So it reads, Greenberg at 1971 noted that 4 of the 5 members of his Afroasiatic language phylum are located on the African continent, and only 1 mainly in southwestern Asia. Therefore, he saw the mother language from which they descended as being in northeastern Africa. So here's a great book dealing with the origin of Semites called Semitic Languages, Outline of a Comparative Grammar by E. Lipsky. So it reads, this implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC in the Neolithic subplume of 5,500 through 3,500 BC, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place as in other moist temperate or subtropical regions, and there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. A worsening of environmental conditions is indicated in North Africa in 3500 BC, with disappearance of vegetation, a major faunal break, desertification, and desertization. This might have been the period when the speakers of Proto-Semitic passed through the Nile Delta from the west to the east and reached Western Asia, where written documents of the 3rd millennium BC preserved notable traces of pre-Semitic, and in Mesopotamia also pre-Sumerian substratum. Thus, from North Africa, wave after wave of Semitic migrations would seem to have set forth. The earliest of these migrants and those who went furthest to the east were the Akkadians, who journeyed along the Fertile Crescent through Palestine and Syria and crossed over into Mesopotamia, reached northern Babylon in 3000 BC, and founded the first Semitic empire at Kish. The southern Semites would seem to have reached the moisture highlands of the Yemen and Hajnite after 2000 BC, following the collapse of the early Bronze Age culture in Palestine, while the Ethiopians would have crossed over to the Horn of Africa when drier conditions prevailed in southern Arabia in 15,000 through 500 BC. So again, here's a visual representation of Proto-Afro-Asiatics migrating out of North Africa when the Sahara was once green. Here is a good study to read from the science magazine called The Origins of Afro-Asiatic. This is by Christopher Ehret, S.O.Y. Cato, and Paul Newman. So it reads, this extensive, well-grounded linguistic research places the Afroasiatic homeland in the southeastern Sahara or adjacent Horn of Africa. And when all of Afroasiatic's branches are included, strongly indicate a pre-food producing Proto-Afro-Asiatic economy. A careful reading of Diakonoff shows his continuing adherence to his long-held position of an exclusive African origin for the family. He explicitly describes Proto-Afro-Asiatic vocabulary as consistent with non-food producing vocabulary and links it to pre-Neolithic cultures in the Levant and in Africa south of Egypt, noting the latter to be older. Diakonoff does revise his location for the common the common Semitic homeland, moving it from entirely within Northeast Africa to areas straddling the Nile Delta and Sinai, but continues to place the origins of the 5 other branches of Afroasiatic language family wholly in Africa. One interpretation of the archaeological data supports a pre-food producing population movement from Africa to the Levant, consistent with the linguistic argument for a pre-Neolithic migration of pre-Proto-Semitic speakers out of Africa via Sinai. Furthermore, the archaeology of northern Africa does not support the dynamic diffusion of farming populations from the Near East. From this continuity, it has been argued that the pre-food production Caspian peoples spoke languages ancestral to Berber and / Chadic branches of Afroasiatic, placing the Proto-Afro-Asiatic period distinctly before 10,000 years ago. Furthermore, there is evidence that cattle domestication occurred independently in the early Heliocene Eastern Sahara, earlier than the Near East, casting doubt on the idea of a single origin of food production in the Levant. A critical reading of the genetic data analysis, especially those of Y chromosome phylogeography and TAQL49AF haplotypes, supports the hypothesis of populations moving from the Horn or southeastern Sahara northward to the Nile Valley, Northwest Africa, the Levant, and Aegean. The geography of M35/215 lineages, which is of Horn/East African origin, is largely coordinated with the range of Afroasiatic languages. Underhill stated that this lineage was carried from Africa during the Mesolithic. The distributions of the Afroasiatic branches and its lineages can best be explained by invoking movements that originated in Africa and occurred before the emergence of food production as well as after. So here is this map of haplogroup E throughout Africa. Here is the spread of Proto-Afro-Asiatic as it overlaps each other. And so this paper right here actually will show you how perfectly haplogroup E matches this migration of Afroasiatics in North Africa. This paper is called The Phylogeography of Y Chromosome Binary Haplotypes and the Origins of Modern Human Populations. And here are the various scientists that were part of this study. The expansion of Neolithic farmers from the Middle East into Europe is also represented in the NRY data, although suggesting a relatively localized area of impact. As mentioned before, in the relation to Africa NRY history, a Mesolithic population carrying group 3 lineages with the M35/M215 mutation expanded northwards from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Levant. The Levantine population of farmers that dispersed into Europe during and after the Neolithic carried these African group 3 M35/M215 lineages. Group 3 lineages are found at high frequencies in Africa and relatively high frequencies in the Middle East and Southern Europe, characterized by M35/M215 mutation, with occasional occurrences in Central Asia, Pakistan, and North America. Most notably, the PN2 transition unites two high frequencies subclades defined by M2/PN1/M180 mutations in sub-Saharan Africa and M35/M215 in North and East Africa, the Mediterranean basin, and Europe. We suggest a population with this subclade of the African YAP/M145/M203/2/PN2 cluster expanded into the south and eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Paleocene. These lineages would have been introduced then from the Middle East into southern Europe and to the lesser extent northern India and Pakistan by farmers during the Neolithic expansion. Overall, again, we see that haplogroup E is the best candidate for the lineage of early Afroasiatic and Semitic populations. One of the top three beliefs for the origins of Afroasiatic, including Semites, is that they emerged from North Africa and carried haplogroup E. Now, how would these early Afroasiatic and Semitic people look? So, I believe that the best phenotype would be the Saharan Ethiopic. The Saharan Ethiopic phenotype fits because of the time period. The Ethiopic type that was most common during the Neolithic, which is what we're covering for the origin of Afroasiatic and haplogroup E, when the Sahara was still green, which fits with the green Sahara, as we said earlier. Their phenotype is reddish brown, black skin, tight curly hair, dully mesocephalic. The other phenotype that best fits is the West Ethiopic subtype that was more widespread across the Western Saharan region during the Neolithic, when the area was still a green savanna, which is what we've been covering. Reddish medium to dark brown skin, wavy to tightly curly hair, dolichocephalic, pseudo-Semitic features, very interesting. Many appear in some individuals, somewhat prognathinous. There's always been a notion that Semites originated from Africa and that they are African people. This is something that you'll see a lot when it comes to the origin of Semites, that they are basically African in origin. A good book to read is Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, who says Greenberg determined that Semitic languages really form only one of 6 or more branches of a much larger language family, Afroasiatic. Even the Semitic subfamily itself is mainly African. 12 of its 19 surviving languages are confined to Ethiopia. This suggests that Afroasiatic languages arose in Africa and that only one branch of them spread to the Near East. Hence, it may have been Africa that gave birth to the languages spoken by the authors of the Old and New Testaments and the Quran, the moral pillars of Western civilization. And here is a conversation with Christopher Eretz, another linguist who covers the origins of Semites. He says, after all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. One of the world's most renowned linguists is basically saying that early Semites were Africans. So, conclusion. The ancestors of the Israelites, Afroasiatic Semitic people, could have emerged from North Africa. Therefore, their genotype would likely be Y-DNA haplogroup E, and phenotypically they would have looked like a Neolithic North African. And here's all the information put together. The DNA and the language migration being simultaneous, the phenotype, the spread of Afroasiatic languages, and the spread of haplogroup E, all fit as one. The final theory for the origin of Semites and Afroasiatic is the Levant, or Israel. So let's look at the Levant origins of Afroasiatics. So this is a book written by a German linguist, and it says, in order to reconstruct in our imagination the remote past of humans, scholars study first of all material reminders reminders of previous times, remainders of previous times, human bones, tools, paintings, etc. These studies have advanced dramatically over recent years, both thanks to new findings and to the new interpretations of old findings. Only a few scholars know, though, that in many cases, linguists and not anthropologists and archaeologists were the first who came to complete conclusions on the basis of linguistic reconstruction. Their conclusions were confirmed by archaeologists somewhat later and quite independently. Such was the conclusion that ancient Near East cultures of the Natufian type were much older and much more developed than previously thought. Linguists not only reconstructed the lexicon of Natufians, which contained words designating some very significant tools and processes. They also date it by the 12th millennium before present, BP. And they showed that Natufians spoke the Afroasiatic language just before this language started to disintegrate into daughter languages, Semitic, Cushitic, and Chadic. So here is the Natufian zone or the Natufian region of where they were concentrated, basically from the Dead Sea region and the Negev all the way up into Syria. And here is the home of Proto-Semitic, and they both encompass the same region of the Levant. Now here's another good book dealing with the origins of Afro-Asiatic from a Levantine source. And it says, given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. And so here again is the area of the Natufian culture in what is known as the Levant. So here is a paper from the Science magazine titled Farmers and Their Languages, the First Expansions. This is by Jared Diamond and Peter Bellwood. So it reads, Afroasiatic. This language family consists of 6 branches, 5 including ancient Egyptian, confined to North Africa, 1 Semitic, also extended in ancient times to Southwest Asia. That distribution suggests an African origin for the family, whose Semitic branch might then have spread into Southwest Asia. But the overwhelming archaeological attested flow of domesticated crops and animals from the Neolithic times onward into Egypt and through the Arabian Peninsula into Ethiopia is out of West Asia rather than out of Africa. That would make it surprising for Semitic languages to have spread against that stream. There are 2 principal competing hypotheses for the origins of Afroasiatic, one based on reconstruction of early vocabulary for cultural and environmental fragments placed the home in the Levant during the earliest Neolithic, the late Neolithic culture 9500 BC, with a subsequent 2 prolonged spread by 5000 BC that is well documented archaeologically. Mixed farming across the Nile into Egypt and North Africa, giving rise to the Egyptian and Berber branches of Afroasiatic languages, and sheep and goat-based pastoralism from Western Asia across the Red Sea into Ethiopia and Sudan, giving rise to the Cushitic, Omotic, and Chadic branches. Semitic spread into Ethiopia much later. That Southwest Asian origin will now be masked by language replacement in the homeland, including the spread of Semitic branch of Afroasiatic languages, including Akkadian or Babylonian, Aramaic, and Arabic in historic times. So here's that spread of these Afroasiatics from the Fertile Crescent. This is a map displaying this. And here is a linguistic map showing it as well, the Afroasiatic in this blue color. As you can see, Afroasiatics came into Africa either through Sinai or through the Red Sea. So here is a paper from ResearchGate, the prehistory of a dispersal, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic farming lexicon. This is by Alexander Matov, and he says, deduce below are more than 30 common Afro-Asiatic Semitic terms, most of which obviously relate to farming, while some may relate to either farming or the collecting of wild cereal and fruit. The northern branch of Afro-San, Egyptian, Semitic, Chadic, and Berber, and the southern branch, Cushitic and Omotic. The Proto-Afro-San speakers can be identified with high probability with the creators of the Natufian and post-Natufian early Neolithic archaeological culture of the Levant. The identification of Proto-Afro-Sans as Natufians and post-Natufians seem to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are a set of reconstructed Proto-Afro-San terms pointing to incipient animal breeding. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where population began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. Now here's a paper dealing with the spread of people in the Levant in that time period. This paper is called Why Chromosome Diversity Characterized the Gulf of Oman, and it reads, the role of the Levant in the Neolithic dispersal of E3B1-M35 sublineages is supported by the data. So basically, E-M35 spread around the same time Afroasiatic spread. And we can see down here when it's dealing with the branches, one branch of E-M35, such as Z827, was spread into North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Fertile Crescent, East Africa, Anatolia, Europe, and Southwest Asia. Another branch of M78 was spread into North Africa, East Africa, Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, Anatolia, and the Fertile Crescent. And so as we can see here, the spread of the E branches went into Europe, as they said, went into North Africa, and even went into Arabia, and some even went further south into the Horn of Africa, going out of Arabia and into Mesopotamia, as we can see here. So E does perfectly fit that spread of Afroasiatics from the Levant throughout both Africa and West Asia, or the Middle East. Now here is that spread of Afroasiatics from the Levant based on language and not DNA. As we can see here, the AA, which stands for Afroasiatic, spread into the Mesopotamia region, spread throughout Arabia, and into the Horn of Africa. And then we have Afroasiatics also spread through Sinai into North Africa and other parts of Africa. And so here is just a visual representation of everything. We have the area of Natufian culture. We have the spread of haplogroup E, and we have the spread of Afroasiatic right here. So here is a paper dealing with the ancestors of Afroasiatics and Natufians in the Levant. This paper is called The Genetic Linguistic Inference, and it is by St. Clair Michael. And so it reads, the 2005 book First Farmers of Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. Prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agricultural in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. The Afroasiatic language family contains 376 languages. These languages are distributed throughout the Middle East, as well as in North Africa, East Africa, and West Central Africa. Afroasiatic is subdivided into 6 main branches: Egyptian, Semitic, Chadic, Cushitic, Omotic, and Berber. Long-standing opinion among linguists places the prehistoric origins of Afroasiatic languages somewhere in East Africa. Interestingly, linguistic data may also support this model of Afroasiatic origins using linguistic reconstruction. Matolvi 2002 presented a proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon of farming terminology. Based on the reconstruction, he suggested that the Natufians, agriculture, and Afroasiatic co-evolved in Southwest Asia. Finally, another reason for identifying Southwest Asia as the plutonic homeland of Afroasiatic languages is the Y chromosome data as presented below in section 4 and 5. So this is going to deal with the DNA. So it says, focusing now on the green cluster, figure 5.5.4 reflects the mutation within this cluster are variants of the E-Z827 haplogroup. An interesting study from 2016, Lizards was able to extract 3 ancient DNA samples from a Natufian archaeological site in Israel. As the reader may recall from section 2, the Natufians were the last hunter-gatherers of Southwest Asia. 2 of the samples belong to E-PF1961, which is an ancestral marker for E-M34. The E-M34 mutation has a widespread distribution currently found in populations of the Mediterranean Europe, Southeastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa. For linguists, the E-M34 mutation is significant as it represents a potential back to Africa marker that co-expanded from Southwest Asia into East Africa with goat and sheep herders about 6,000 years ago. This Neolithic migration, as the reader may recall from section 3, appears to have carried Afroasiatic languages from Southwest Asia to East and North Africa. The ancient Natufian Y chromosome data, as just presented, supports this position because E-PF1961 mutation is an upstream marker from E-M34. Thus, E-M34 probably evolved in the Middle East. Additional analysis of contemporary genetic data also supports Middle East, the agricultural origins of Afroasiatic languages in East Africa. Kutumving, a 2004 study, suggested that E-M34 arose in the Levant based on their interpretation of the data and wider distribution of this marker outside of Africa. Additionally, Cadis, a 2008 study, date the E-M123 mutation in the Middle East to about 11,000 years ago, which potentially places the evolution of the downstream E-M34 mutation during the Southwest Asian Neolithic. So now let's visualize the mutation of Afroasiatics from the Levant, and also let's visualize the migration of haplogroup E from the Levant. Alright, so disclaimer, I'm going to play this video and I am protected under fair use. This is for educational purposes and research and teaching. So the video that I'm about to play, I am protected under fair use. For this next video that I'm about to play, I just want to make it clear again that I'm protected under the Fair Use Act, and that the video that I'm about to play is for teaching purposes and it's uh, for disseminating information and research. And I am protected under the Fair Use Act. Now, what's interesting about the Levant origins of Afro-Asiatics is that it's actually believed that Semites specifically descend from the Natufians or Neolithic Levantines. According to the book In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory by John D. Bingston, he says this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. Now, with that being said, Neolithic Levantines, the ancestors of Proto-Semites, the only haplogroup that they had was haplogroup E. This is a book. This is a paper called Genomic Inference, Genomic Insight into the Origin of Farming in the Ancient Near East, and it says craniometric analysis have suggested an affinity between the Natufians and populations of North or Sub-Saharan Africa, a result that finds some support from Y chromosome analysis, which shows that the Natufians, the successor Levantine Neolithic population, carried haplogroup E of likely ultimate African origin, which has not been detected in other ancient males from Western Asia. Here's a paper called Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. And it reads, this finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epiolithic Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. The latest study on the origins of the Semitic language has its birth in the Levant, it of course being the descendants of the Natufians. And this paper called Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus revealed core of West Eurasian ancestry says such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. So here's the paper dealing with the latest origin for the Semitic languages. It's called the Bayesian Phylogenetic Analysis of Semitic Languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. And so it reads, the evolution of languages provides a unique opportunity to study human population history. The origin of Semitic and the nature of dispersals by Semitic-speaking populations are of great importance to our understanding of the ancient history of the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. Our statistical tests of alternative Semitic histories support an additional divergence of Akkadian from ancestral Semitic over competing hypotheses, i.e., an African origin of Semitic. We estimate an early Bronze Age origin for Semitic approximately 5,750 years ago in the Levant, and further propose that contemporary Ethio-Semitic languages of Africa reflect a single introduction of early Ethio-Semitic from southern Arabia approximately 2,800 years ago. So our analysis of the Semitic language family produced a deep phylogeny that estimates the origin of Semitic at approximately 4,400 through 7,400 YBP. This result indicates that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset have been spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7,400 YBP, after having diverged from Afroasiatic in Africa. So the Semitic people, Semitic branch of languages, dispersed out of Africa from the other Afroasiatic family. And so it says the discovery of such early Semitic languages could increase estimates of the age of Semitic and alter its geographical origin if these early Semitic languages were found in Africa rather than in the Middle East. And so here's the migration from the study showing that Afroasiatic, the origin of Afroasiatic being in Africa, placing it actually in northeastern Africa. And then here is ancestral Semitic, again, still in Africa, but also in Arabia should we say, Sinai, and then the dispersal of Semitic from the Levant, right here with its origin point. So it says map of Semitic languages and inferred dispersal, and it says the map also presents the dispersal of Semitic languages inferred from our study and origin of Afro-Asiatic along the African coast of the Red Sea, supported by comparative analysis, is indicated in red, although other African origins of Afro-Asiatic have been proposed. Southwest Ethiopia by Blench 2006, which we read earlier, the assumed location of the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic between the African coast of the Red Sea and the Near East is 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 indicated in italics. And so here it is right here. Origin of Afroasiatic, then ancestral Semitic near Sinai, and then Semitic itself dispersing in the Levant. So it reads, our estimate for the origin of Semitic 4,400 through 7,400 YBP predates the first Akkadian inscriptions in the archaeological record of northern Mesopotamia by approximately 100 through 3000 BC. The city-state of Sumer were established and flourishing in Mesopotamia with their own indigenous language unrelated to Semitic by approximately 5,400 YBP. So it is unlikely that Akkadian was spoken in Sumer for the entirety of the possible 3,000-year interval between the origin of Semitic and Akkadian's initial appearance in the archaeological record. The presence of ancient members of the two oldest Semitic groups, East and West Semitic, in the same region of the Levant, combined with a possible long interval, 100 through 3,000 years, between the origin of Semitic and the appearance of Akkadian in Sumer, suggesting a Semitic origin in the Near East Levant, and a later movement of Akkadian eastward into Mesopotamia and Sumer. We used Bayesian phylogenetic methods to elucidate the relationship and divergence date of Semitic languages, which we then relate to the epigraphic and archaeological record to produce a comparative analysis of Semitic origins and dispersals after the divergence of ancestral Semitic from Afroasiatic in Africa. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 YBP, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. What's interesting about this model for the spread of Proto-Semitic languages is that it fits the exact same spread of haplogroup E. So let's keep this model in mind. They have Semitic popping up, or should we say, cultivating itself in the Levant and then dispersing and going all throughout Mesopotamia and going into Arabia and back into the Horn of Africa. It fits exactly with what haplogroup E did if it originated in the Levant. It will go into Mesopotamia, and it will go into Arabia, and it will go back into Africa in the Horn of Africa. So here is it put together. We have right here the origin of the Semitic languages, some remaining in the Levant, some going into Mesopotamia, some going into North Africa with Moroccan Arabic, and then some going into Arabia, and then some going into the Horn of Africa. Same thing with E-M35. You have some going towards Mesopotamia, you have some going into North Africa, some going into Arabia, and then others going into the Horn of Africa. So it fits perfectly. Haplogroup E and Proto-Semitic. Now, ironically, or perhaps unironically, it is believed that Proto-Semites had haplogroup E and spread it particularly from the Levant. Here's a study that actually says this. E-M123 originated some 19,000 years ago during the last ice age. Its place of origin is uncertain, but it was probably in the Red Sea region, somewhere between the southern Levant and Ethiopia. Its main subclade, E-M34, most probably emerged in the Levant about 15,000 years ago. Soon afterwards, M34 split into two branches, M84 and Z841, which were probably found in the Fertile Crescent during the Neolithic period. And so here's the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, which encompasses Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. So E-M34 lineages experienced a much more dramatic expansion during the Copper Age, or known as the Chalcolithic period. Also downstream of CTS 1096, the Y14891 and Z21018 clades are typically found among people of Jewish ancestry, while PF6391 and Z21421 are found in the Levant, specifically Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, and the Arabian Peninsula. F1382 appears to have expanded during the Iron Age from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula, where it is exclusively found today. So here's the spread of haplogroup E from the Levant. As we can see right here, a very old point of origin. And then over here, we see another branch or another old sample found. Over here is the dates, by the way. So we see the oldest date being in the Levant, and then another date popping up, I would say, in between the Levant and Mesopotamia in the northern part of Arabia. And here's another old sample we found. And then here are the samples here's the old sample, and then here are the people that descend from it, mostly Middle Eastern populations. And then here's another sample that pops up 7,500 years, and then here are the people who descend from it, Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations. And then we get an even younger sample in Mesopotamia, and here are all the populations that descend from it. Again, Middle Eastern and Mediterranean populations. And so when we put all together, we do see this expansion of a lot of old samples of E in the Levant, but as you go outwards, the samples get a bit younger, and we see these haplogroup E individuals in Mesopotamia and going into Arabia, which fits with the Semites going from the Levant into Mesopotamia, specifically people like the Eastern Akkadians and their descendants. Haplogroup E is the best candidate for the lineage of early Afroasiatic and Semitic populations. One of the top three beliefs for the origins of Afroasiatic, including Semites, is that they emerged from the Levant and carried haplogroup E. Now, how would these Natufians, the ancestors of Semites, look like? Here is a paper that actually goes into this, the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form. And so it says, it is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis and the Egyptian Bronze Age sample from Naquata may also have a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. Next, the Congo, Dahomey, and Hemia samples were run as a Niger-Congo twin. Then Naquata Bronze Age Egyptian, the Nubian, Nubia Bronze Age, Israeli Falahim Arabic farmers, and Somali samples were lumped as prehistoric/recent Northeast Africa. So here is the Niger-Congo and the Natufian, and there seems to be like a point of origin or a split. Basically, they have a very similar form about them. And then here is the Niger-Congo, the Natufian, and prehistoric/northeast, recent Northeast Africa, and Natufian sort of sits in between the two of them. So Natufian sort of looks like something in between a Niger-Congo person and a recent/prehistoric Northeast African. So it says, the Niger-Congo speakers, Dahomey, Congo and Hemnia cluster closely with each other and a bit less closely with the Nubian sample, both the recent and the Bronze Age Nubians, and more remotely with the Naqada Bronze Age sample of Egypt, the modern Somalis, and the Arab-speaking Falahim farmers of Israel. When those samples were separated and ran in a single analysis, as in Figure 1, there clearly is a tie between them that is diluted the further one gets from sub-Saharan Africa. If the late Paleocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance to the late prehistoric Eurasian element. So this is a reconstruction of a Natufian from Jericho, and this is the way that he would have looked. And here to me is a picture of the same Natufian next to Common, and in my opinion, I believe that this Natufian does resemble Common. From the nose, the lips, the cheekbones, the head, everything about it kind of makes me think that this Natufian will look something like him. So, conclusion. The ancestors of the Israelites, Afroasiatic Semitic people, could have emerged from the Levant, specifically Neolithic Levantines or Natufians. The genotype, therefore, would be Y-DNA haplogroup E, and their phenotype would be Natufian. And here is all the information put together for this. The fact that haplogroup E is considered to be Proto-Semitic, the fact that Natufians were in the Levant, which is the same place where Semitic originated in, and the same place where haplogroup E could have dispersed from, and phenotypically, here is the phenotype of the Natufians. So with all that put together, this is what we have on one screen. Now, putting everything together that we said, what are the locations for the origin of Afroasiatics? So Afroasiatics would have emerged either in the Horn of Africa, Yemen, Arabian Peninsula, Eastern Sahara, Nile Valley / Red Sea, North Africa, Sahara / Sahel, or the Levant with the Natufians. These are the general homelands for the origin of Afroasiatic people. Basically, the origins of Afroasiatic and the origins of haplogroup E overlap one another. As we can see, most of the studies we read about haplogroup E, they say that it either popped up in Africa or in the Middle East. And the same thing goes with Proto-Afro-Asiatic. It either emerged in Africa or the Middle East. And when we deal with specific populations, it tends to be the exact same population, such as Proto-Afro-Asiatic and haplogroup E, both emerging sort of like in the Horn of Africa or in Yemen or in Arabia or in the Eastern Sahara or in North Africa or in the Levant. They always seem to overlap each other with the same time period and the same type of people. Afroasiatic basically equals haplogroup E. It's pretty much been established by most linguists and geneticists that haplogroup E males were the originators of the Afroasiatic languages. Haplogroup E1b1b, formerly known as E3b, represents the last major direct migration from Africa into Europe. E1b1b lineages are closely linked to the diffusion of Afroasiatic languages. Most of the Afroasiatic speakers share the lineage defined by Yap descendants called PN2/215/M35. And the Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups, including current speakers of the Afroasiatic language and pastoralist populations. If you look at a map of Afroasiatic languages and a map of haplogroup E, both Afroasiatic and haplogroup E overlap one another. So here is a map of Afroasiatic languages being spoken in Africa and the Middle East, and here is a map of haplogroup E. And as we can see, they seem to overlap one another. They actually overlap one another beautifully. The Afroasiatic people and the Afroasiatic tongue, and haplogroup E. As a matter of fact, Christopher Ehret and Shlomo Katzi have suggested that the geography of the E1B1B lineage uh, con- uh, coincides with the distribution of Afroasiatic languages. And I agree with that. So Afroasiatic and haplogroup E hauntingly overlap one another. It's not shocking why most scholars would agree haplogroup E men were the first Afroasiatic speakers and spread both their language and Y DNA. Haplogroup E is seen in some of the oldest Afroasiatic speaking regions, but not only did we find old samples of haplogroup E in Afroasiatic territory, but to this day we still see haplogroup E dominating these regions. So we find, for instance, E-M81 in Morocco. We find E-Z830, old samples by the way. In Israel, we find E-M34 in the Jordan, which is in the Levant. We find E-M78 in Morocco as well as in the Jordan. We find E-V22 in Egypt, E-L618 in the region of the Mediterranean, and we find E-V13 in the Greek region of the Balkans. And here is another distribution just showing the Afroasiatic languages and how it overlaps with haplogroup E. And it perfectly overlaps one another. So Afroasiatic and haplogroup E also fit well with the migration of both the language and the haplogroup, as well as pastoralism from the Levant region. Remember, if Afroasiatics and haplogroup E migrated from the Levant, we can see that they both overlap one another perfectly. So no matter where you put the origins of haplogroup E or the spread of haplogroup E, no matter where you put the origins of Afroasiatic and the spread of Afroasiatic, E is always involved. They perfectly overlap one another no matter where you put it. With that being said, seeing how well Afroasiatic and haplogroup E overlap, I agree with the linguists and the geneticists that say haplogroup E is the founder of Afroasiatic. I believe this is the most logical way to go about things. Again, here is the ancient form of Afroasiatics, and here is where they are today with haplogroup E, both ancient and modern. With that all being said, I say that when it comes to the ancestors of the Israelites, that they, being an Afroasiatic Semitic people, would have Y DNA chromosome haplogroup E from their male lineage. This seems to be the most logical deduction based on all the information given. That if the Israelites are a Semitic people and if they are descending from Shem, it is highly likely that they would be E carriers from the male lineage, just going based on logic, going based on language, migration, and DNA. And generally, it is believed that the origins of Afroasiatic was either in the Horn of Africa, Eastern Sahara, North Africa, or the Levant Natufians. Again, reading all this, in red it says, the Semitic family is a member of the larger Afroasiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. So what we see here in red, this is one of the theories we covered, how Semites would have, the ancestors of Semites, Proto-Semites, or the first Semites would have came out of North Africa. Now let's read what's in green. Diakonoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northernmost branch of Afroasiatic. So in green, basically one of the theories that we covered is that that Semites would have popped up and migrated and originated in the Nile region and in Canaan. Now here in blue it says Blench even wonders whether the highly divergent Gurage languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. So here in blue, Blench theory is that Semites, including Afroasiatics, but Semites specifically, could have originated in Ethiopia itself or in the Horn of Africa. And then, of course, the last one here in yellow says, according to Christy G. Turner, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufians. So here in yellow, basically, this is the Levant origin or the Natufian origin of Semites. And over here to the right of your screen, we have the Horn African origin of Semites, the Eastern Saharan, Nile Valley, and North African origin of Semites. And over here, we have the Levant and Natufian origin of Semites. Basically, Semites, overwhelmingly, most believe that they could have originated in Africa. And of course, there is a theory that it could originate in the Middle East, where haplogroup E would have dominated in ancient times and even still dominate today. So we conclude with this study, the origins of Proto-Afro-Asiatics, and returning back to the main point, as I said, if the Israelites are a Semitic people, an Afro-Asiatic people, and if their ancestors are also a Proto-Semitic people, then it is likely that they would be carriers of haplogroup E, both their ancestors, their Proto-Semitic ancestors, and the Israelites themselves. And I'm basing this on logic and on the studies we've read about the origins of Afroasiatics, Proto-Semites, and haplogroup E. And I believe this is the best way to go about things when it comes to studying these people. And so far, this is what I am leaning towards when it comes to the Y chromosome, the Y DNA of the Israelites. It would be an E marker. And this is where we conclude. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. Leave a comment, like, and subscribe. And there will be more information and videos coming out soon. And we will have Q&As one day where you can ask me questions. And have a great day. Shalom.